It didn't begin with a declaration of war. There were no soldiers, no bloodshed, just a cold, hard number announced from the White House, 35%. On August 1st, 2025, President Donald Trump signed what seemed like a simple trade executive order, but this wasn't economic policy. It was a geopolitical statement. Within just 48 hours, a wave of new tariffs followed. 30% on goods from the EU and Mexico, and at its peak, a stunning 50% on all European products, a preemptive strike with no warning. There was no G7 summit, no reference to the WTO, no multilateral coordination, just one signature. But that single signature sent shockwaves through the global order, shaking the very foundation of what the world once believed to be stable. Over $2 trillion in global trade was suddenly thrown into uncertainty. A historic $43 billion Boeing deal, once seen as a cornerstone of America's strategic exports to Europe, was immediately canceled. Canada, long considered America's safest and closest ally, coldly announced it would seek more stable, long-term partners. From Tokyo to Berlin, phone calls weren't about finding common ground with the US, but about figuring out how to exit the vortex of chaos unleashed by Washington. And strangely enough, there was no outcry, no emergency summits, no blunt warnings. The world simply turned its back. And that was the scariest part, because the real danger wasn't in the shouting, it was in the calculated silence. A quiet, deliberate withdrawal. Capital began to trickle away. Contracts were delayed. Factories started drawing up relocation plans. International financial institutions began reassessing US risk, not because America had weakened, but because it had become unpredictable. And above all, the events of August 1st were no longer viewed as isolated policy. They became the symbol of a new era, an America acting like an island nation, powerful yet isolated, influential yet no longer capable of forging unity. In the stillness that followed, somewhere else began to move. Not with angry tweets, not with retaliatory tariffs, but with strategy, patient, deliberate, and transformational. Immediately after the US triggered the tariffs, Brussels, the political heart of Europe, launched a fresh wave of trade negotiations. The US wasn't on the list, but Canada was, Japan was, Vietnam too, and rising partners from the global south. And from there, Europe's response took shape, quiet but precise, not vengeful, but methodical, not aiming to retaliate, but to replace. And that's what made the rest of the world stop and watch, because Brussels wasn't just reacting to a tariff, they were rewriting the framework for cooperation. A world that doesn't need America to function, but one that, in facing America's shocks, learned how to grow stronger without it. No one heard Europe's footsteps, but when they stepped forward, the whole system trembled. Right after the White House issued its tariff decree, Brussels didn't rush to hold a press conference. There was no theatrical response. Instead, they did what they've always done best, acted silently but with precision, down to every clause in every new agreement. On the day America built tariff walls, Europe opened new doors, no longer waiting for Washington, but proactively creating a parallel network of trade. And it wasn't just trade, it came with a full framework of values, from environmental protections and artificial intelligence standards to labor rights and digital data governance. Inside the EU, no one called this a retaliation. That would imply America still held a central role, a notion Brussels no longer recognized. Rather than waste energy on confrontation, Europe seized the shock as an opportunity to break free from a cycle of dependence. Stalled negotiations with ASEAN, Mercosur, India, and even parts of Africa were immediately revived. The US was no longer on the board, and those partners, once hesitant for fear of upsetting Washington, now signed with confidence. What stood out most was that Europe wasn't trying to build a new America, but a different model altogether, multipolar, sustainable, and without any single country in absolute control. EU partnerships came bundled with specific terms on renewable energy, traceability, carbon taxes, and data fairness, things America had begun to abandon under Trump. The world was finally given a choice, and once there's a choice, faith in the old model begins to erode. The tipping point came with a name once seen as America's trusted companion, Boeing. When the EU suspended multiple aerospace contracts and European carriers publicly turned to Comac, the Chinese aircraft manufacturer, this was no longer just economic maneuvering. It was a shift in trust. When European policymakers began asking, If America can change the rules overnight, why are we still playing by them? The very foundation of Washington's credibility had begun to crack. But what surprised many even more was the quiet rise of a country long seen as America's shadow, Canada. As Europe looked to replace its fragile trade ties with Washington, it didn't turn to Beijing. It looked north, not to the United States, but to Canada, a country that embodied Western values without the political volatility, an economy marked by stability, a trusted legal system, and perhaps most importantly, a web of trade agreements untouched by White House temper tantrums. And so Ottawa was no longer just a place for signing appendices. It became the hub, the gateway, a new companion, quietly stepping in to take the place of the old guide. And that is the next chapter worth watching in this story that's redrawing the map of global power. Canada didn't need to say much. All they had to do was act at the right moment. While Washington dropped a tariff bomb that shook the global trade system, and most nations were still scrambling with the question of how to respond, Ottawa quietly stepped through the open door of opportunity. They didn't oppose the US. They didn't need to declare separation. They simply stepped aside, held steady, and let the world see the difference for itself. The CETA free trade agreement between Canada and the European Union, once seen as a symbolic experiment, suddenly became a true golden bridge. As European businesses searched for a politically safe partner to access the North American market without the risks of Washington, Canada emerged as a clean, trustworthy, and easy to work with destination. Quebec and Ontario became bold red dots on the map of a newly forming supply chain. European producers in technology, clean energy, and strategic materials began to pour in. And while the US dollar got entangled in domestic political battles, the Canadian dollar quietly became a symbol of stability, the very thing the world was now desperately looking for. What's striking is that Canada didn't need to reinvent itself to step in for America. It simply stayed true to the values that the US was now abandoning: fair trade, long-term cooperation, respect for the rules. No need to flaunt military might. No need to shout in international forums. Canada proved that influence doesn't have to come in a superpower's shadow. Sometimes, a former supporting role, if positioned just right, can become the new center the world revolves around. The change came slowly but steadily. No one expected major corporations from Germany, France, and the Netherlands, companies long rooted in the American logistics network, to suddenly reroute through Vancouver or Halifax. No one thought a country once labeled too gentle to lead would become the launchpad for a new wave of sustainable post-America trade agreements. But then the world saw the most important truth of all. In an age where political risk outweighs profit, trust becomes the most strategic commodity. And Canada is supplying it consistently, quietly, but irreplaceably. Yet within this wave of transformation, some wounds ran deeper than export numbers. One of the most symbolic, Boeing. Once a towering emblem of American pride in transatlantic aviation, the aerospace giant is now facing a crisis of confidence unlike anything in its history. And it all began with one cold, unexpected move. Ryanair, Europe's largest low-cost airline, announced it would suspend a $43 billion deal with Boeing to reevaluate the policy stability of its supplier. A short sentence, but one that rang out like a bell, marking the end of an era. For over 3 decades, the name Boeing didn't just stand for American aerospace technology, it was a symbol of transatlantic trust. Every time a European airline signed a deal with Boeing, it wasn't merely a technical choice. It was a strategic handshake between two civilizations. It represented faith in American quality, stability, and long-term commitment. But then, with just one line from Ryanair, contract suspended to reassess the policy environment, everything began to collapse. The $43 billion deal wasn't just an aircraft order. It was the last bridge connecting Europe to America's export industry. And now, that bridge is cracking under the weight of instability. No one is claiming that Boeing's quality is subpar. No one doubts the talent of American engineers. But what no longer exists is the so-called systemic trust. European CEOs can't build long-term plans when a contract signed in the morning can be rendered meaningless by a presidential tweet in the afternoon. Policy risk, once considered very un-American because it was so rare, has now become the default concern for any potential partner. And when trust and stability begins to falter, even the most advanced technology can't protect a brand from losing its status. What worries Washington isn't just the loss of one contract. It's the loss of something far more valuable, the unspoken assumption that America is always the safe bet. For the first time in modern history, European airlines are openly discussing the possibility of adding Chinese aircraft, like the Comac C99, to their consideration lists. They haven't bought them yet, but just placing them on the table is enough to send a clear signal. The era of "we're always your number one choice" is over. And when even a name like Boeing can be called into question, what American brand can truly escape the growing cloud of doubt? Amazon, Tesla, Intel, all are now being eyed cautiously by international partners, not because of product quality, but because the policy environment has become too unpredictable. A business can't invest in the long term when tomorrow might bring a new tariff, a new executive order, or an unexpected trade war. Amid this uncertainty, a quiet realignment is already underway. There are no protests, no formal declarations of separation, but trade agreements are being rewritten with new standards. Financial institutions are recalculating their exposure to the US dollar, and country by country, from the global south to mid-tier economies, are quietly redesigning their development models, no longer anchored so tightly to Washington. A silent revolution, but an irreversible one, has begun to reshape the entire global system. There were no sirens, no emergency summits, no sensational op-eds, but if you listen closely, you can hear the gears of the global machine slowly shifting in a new direction. Quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. As America chose a path of unilateralism and unpredictability, the rest of the world didn't rally in protest. They simply turned down a different road. And that's how a quiet revolution began, in the smallest of ways, in how trade contracts are rewritten, in how supply chain security is redefined, and in how nations choose their words when speaking of the future. Brussels is no longer just signing trade deals. They're attaching with them an entire ecosystem of standards on labor rights, environmental protection, artificial intelligence, and data security. What were once seen as bureaucratic obstacles are now becoming the foundation of trust. Countries that once feared Europe's rigorous regulatory model are now turning to it, seeking stability amid a geopolitical storm. Because in a world where a superpower can flip the chessboard overnight, transparency, consistency, and clear legal commitments become the final line of defense. Even values once dismissed as luxuries in international trade, like carbon tax fairness, product life cycle assessments, or personal data protection, are now becoming the passports into the new supply chain. And most notably, the United States is absent from these negotiation tables, not because they've been excluded, but because they're no longer assumed to be essential. The global reference point is shifting. Institutions like the WTO, once steered by American vision, are now seen as sluggish and outdated. In their place rise regional trade blocs like CPTPP, RCEP, and a wave of new generation bilateral agreements, more flexible, more pragmatic, and with no single country holding a monopoly on leadership. On the financial front, the shift is even quieter. Central banks are quietly diversifying their foreign reserves, reducing their dependence on the US dollar. New trade settlement systems are being built around the euro, the Japanese yen, even China and India's digital currencies. A world where Washington is no longer the only axis is gradually taking shape, not with fanfare or confrontation, but with undeniable reality. And as new standards settle in, as new trade and financial hubs begin to form, the inevitable comes next. America's longtime allies are being forced to make choices. Not all want to drift from Washington, but as the shadow of unpredictability grows, even the closest partners are compelled to find new paths forward, not out of betrayal, but out of necessity. And from that, a quiet but powerful wave has begun to spread. From Mexico to Japan, from ASEAN to South America, names once thought inseparable from the US, now scripting their own playbooks for a new era. No one expected Mexico, a country once so tightly bound to the US under NAFTA that the two seemed inseparable, to be among the first to quietly forge its own path. But that's exactly what happened. As international investors began to grow wary of Washington's unpredictability, Mexico realized it could no longer anchor its future to a partner increasingly acting unilaterally. They ramped up cooperation with the EU, signed expanded trade clauses with Asian partners, and quietly began integrating European technical standards into their domestic manufacturing systems. No fanfare, no sweeping declarations. But when Mexican shipments started arriving with CO2 neutral certification under Brussels benchmarks, the world understood. Mexico no longer stood in America's shadow. Japan, too, Washington's closest ally in Asia, has shifted course just as quietly. Tokyo hasn't severed ties with the US, but it's making major investments in the East Asian trade ecosystem, betting heavily on RCEP and deepening bilateral commitments with the EU on data, AI, and semiconductor supply chains. At regional summits, Japan no longer refers to America as an irreplaceable pillar, but instead emphasizes the necessity of multilateralism and international standardization. That's how a mature economy withdraws from an outdated model. Not by breaking it down, but by building something better to take its place. ASEAN nations aren't standing still either. Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, all are repositioning themselves in the global trade system. As the US throws up tariff walls and retreats from coordinating supply chains, Vietnam has rapidly emerged as a new transit hub for high-tech manufacturing. But they're not just capitalizing on the moment, they're reshaping the rules of the game. Vietnam's next-gen trade agreements like CPTPP and EVFTA already set standards that even the US hasn't caught up to. While Washington continues to debate internally between protectionism and conditional openness, Vietnam has quietly carved out a position as a model player, not powered by dominance but by dependability. Then there's Brazil, South America's largest economy, once closely tied to US-led financial models, now accelerating deals with China, the EU, and emerging blocs. As America creates a vacuum through its own instability, these nations aren't waiting, they're filling it. Every new commitment, every newly opened trade route is another cut into America's traditional sphere of influence. No one is declaring a break, but everyone is pulling back their trust. And in a world where trust is the most precious currency, this quiet dispersal of influence is the clearest signal yet that the global order is changing. For decades, American power was never up for debate. It existed as a given, like gravity, like an unwritten rule the rest of the world simply revolved around. When Washington nodded, deals were signed. When Washington frowned, markets trembled. It was the age of automatic power, influence that didn't have to be earned or contested. It was assumed, but 2025 marked the end of that assumption. A tariff order issued from the Oval Office sent aftershocks across the globe, not because of the percentage, but because of what it signaled. America was no longer the foundation on which the world could build long-term plans. The world didn't respond with outrage, it responded with movement. Contracts were rewritten, standards were redesigned, trade routes were realigned, no longer dependent on America's participation. Power didn't disappear in a single moment. It eroded, gradually, quietly, through the daily choices of governments and businesses, choosing Canada over the US, choosing the euro over the dollar, choosing Brussels' benchmarks over Washington's. Each of these decisions was a vote against volatility and a declaration that the world had grown up, no longer needing a leader, but needing a responsible partner. The truth is, no one truly wants to push America off the board. But when the shadow of uncertainty grows too large, even the closest allies must ask themselves, can we entrust our future to a country where a single election can overturn every commitment overnight? In that context, values like transparency, stability, and predictability, once default features of the American brand, are now being found elsewhere. In Europe, in Japan, in Southeast Asia, even in countries once underestimated like Vietnam and Brazil. Today's global competition isn't about weapons, resources, or GDP. It's about trust. Whoever builds trust earns partners. Whoever keeps commitments attracts capital. In a world where everything can change with a single tweet, the most valuable currency is consistency. And that consistency is now redefining global leadership. A new era has arrived, an era with no more automatic power, where no nation is automatically the center, where each country must build its role through actions and real values, not the echo of past glory. America can still be a vital part of this world, but to do so, it must relearn how to be a partner, not a commander. It must relearn how to listen, how to keep its word, how to accept that the world no longer spins around it, This isn't the end of America. It's a reminder. Power is not a privilege, it's a responsibility. And if the United States wants to lead again, it must rebuild that leadership, clause by clause, conversation by conversation, action by action. What do you think about the new global order that's emerging? Can America reclaim its place in a multipolar world, one where strength no longer comes from the loudest voice, but the most reliable one? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to hit subscribe so you can join us on future journeys through the shifting world of geopolitics. Because the world is changing. And now, more than ever, we all need to understand it.